Hello, wonderful people of the internet. My name is Matthew. Today, I'm going to be talking about YA literature and children's literature, what I think are the pros and cons of it, and why, while there may be individual books, in my opinion, that stand up to the quality of books in traditional classic high literature, why in general, I don't feel that YA books and children's literature are equal to traditional classical literature. Now, I want to be clear. I don't want to begrudge anyone who reads these books, anyone who enjoys these books, or the time that's spent reading them. I think that's fantastic. In my opinion, you could be reading the funny pages. As long as you're reading, that's a plus for me. But I wanted to give you first the rundown of what I consider the pros of these kinds of books. First of all, there's been a lot of talk about how it's a travesty that they're displacing bookstores. In many cases, this is a good thing. Like, as much as people bash Twilight, I consider it a pro because Twilight and other YA books like Romantasy, they're the things that are keeping bookstores like Barnes & Noble's alive. And as long as those bookstores continue to carry authors like Tolstoy and Steinbeck, I'm happy. If they get to a point where they don't carry those authors anymore, then I can complain. But if they're the ones that are keeping those bookstores alive, I have no issue. I'm thankful for that. The second major point that I think is a positive of these books is that they're a good gateway for people and children who otherwise don't read a lot to get into reading. Like, I remember when I was a child and my sister had her first communion that my mother gave me a bunch of these really dense classic books, like a work of Shakespeare, The Three Musketeers, stuff like that. And I wasn't ready for that. And I do remember distinctly that it was one of the things that kind of hampered my reading for a good number of years. And that the only things I would read aside from that are works for school, which wasn't that many because I was mainly STEM focused. Things like Diary of the Wimpy Kid, Roald Dahl, and Harry Potter. So, again, that's not a lot, but it kept my affinity toward reading alive for all that time. And I've seen other YouTubers like Patrick Book Reviews, his daughter reading Charlotte Webb. That's fantastic. People should be encouraging that. And lastly, these books, even for adult readers like me, could be good whimsical escapism in the sense that, like, after you read such a dense, hard, tragic book, like, for example, I'm reading Mason and Dixon. I'm going to be reading other very dark and gloomy books pretty soon. While there is a lot of value in that style of reading, you do want to mix in a little bit of variety. And some whimsical children's stories are, in many ways, a good way to mix it up. And this brings me to my fourth point, that children's stories, in many cases, can break away from the very tragic-focused areas that are dominant in adult literature. Now, don't get me wrong, I love tragedies. And in many ways, they're realistic. They bring out moments of catharsis unlike any other. But sometimes there's a point where you just want to have a happy ending. And children's literature, when it's at its best, can deliver that. And at least for me, I'm someone who wants that in his life every now and again. Not saying that traditional classic high concept literature doesn't have that, but it is much less prevalent when compared to children or YA literature. Now, with all that being said, I do want to point out that as much as I do think that YA books and children's literature broadly, especially classic children's literature, has its place, I do, in many ways, don't put it at the same level as traditional high adult literature. And there's a couple reasons for that are intrinsic to the genre. One is that, just in general, the diction level is very low. Now, I know all you Hemingway fans are going to come at me. There can be a lot of depth to simple writing. But I am of the opinion that every emotion has its perfect set of words. And the fact that vocabulary is limited in children's literature means that, in many ways, it limits its range. It puts more demands on the writer to pack more meaning into those simple words. Now, like I said with Hemingway, big emotions don't necessarily come with big words, but the fact that you have more words to work with means that you can probably work with more emotions. The second major limitation, it's limited length. Now, again, length doesn't necessarily confer quality. You can have a very big, epic, sprawling story that doesn't have a lot of depth, poor characters, poor story, and it can feel like a drag versus a smaller, well-written, condensed story with great characters and great themes. But one thing that I do believe, and this may be a hot take, but I think most people that sit down and do this kind of challenge would agree, is that most of my favorite books are longer, because while length doesn't necessarily incur greatness, the fact that a book merits a longer length compared to a book that doesn't usually means it has more to say and has more to offer than a book that has a shorter length. Now, this is not a blanket, I don't mean to suggest, and there are some things like the Harry Potter series that are fairly long, but in general, since children's literature has to have a limited length, it is, again, limiting. The third major limitation is that there are restrictions when it comes to subject matter when it comes to children's literature. Now, again, not saying that children's literature can't touch on very adult themes like death, parenting, coming of age. All of those things are valuable, but to some extent, you can't be edgy. You probably can't have a very, not just like something very toxic, like, or something very criminal, like a murder or a very graphic sexual scene or anything like that. Not saying that those things are important in literature, but in many cases, that bite that can come with more hard-hitting, more adult literature is almost stripped away. That edge is smoothed off when it comes to children's literature. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but I like to say it's almost like a burger without ketchup or other amenities, like just a plain meat burger on a bun. It can be great if it's cooked well, but I prefer it with all those other sauces and stuff like that. And the fourth thing is that in many cases, these books have to be simple. You can't have a lot of nuance within the text. It all has to be kind of in the subtext. Otherwise, it just wouldn't make sense for children. It has to be very overt, very surface level. Now, you can add more underneath. I don't deny that. But usually, how much you can have underneath is related to how much you have on top, like the iceberg theory, again, related to Hemingway. In conclusion, while in general, I mostly avoid YA in children's literature, there is plenty of literary merit in it. And I think that very classic books in children's literature and YA, like Little Women, Alice in Wonderland, deserve to be in the pantheon of some of the greatest books ever written, at least the greatest books ever written in English. But I stand by my opinion that for every Alice in Wonderland and every Little Women, there are probably 10 other books written for adults that will hit just as hard as an adult. So, not trying to yuck on other people's young, that's just my take. If you guys have recommendations for children's literature, I would love to read them, and if I enjoy them, I will let you know. I will never lie to you about what I like. So, hope you're having a lovely day. Hope this video finds you well, and happy reading.